Hi everybody, welcome back. This next video is going to be about painting the basics. So we're going to go over a few of the basic painting vocabulary, talk a little about some of the tools that you're going to use this semester, and how to set up your palette. The first vocabulary words I want to talk about have to do with how your paint is made. The first one is medium, a particular medium along with its accompanying technique. This refers to basically what the materials are made out of. And in this class, there are going to be two types of mediums. One is oil paint, two is acrylic paint. It also has a secondary meaning, meaning within paint, the fluid in which the pigment is suspended in, allowing it to spread and adhere to the surface. So the different types of medium actually make up, it defines what makes up the different types of paint. So in oil paint, what do you think that the pigment is suspended in? If you guessed oil, you're correct. Oil paint is a slow drying type of paint. It dates back to the Renaissance. When it was first invented, it was considered a major technological breakthrough, and people were amazed with what they could do with oil paint. It's one of the reasons the Mona Lisa was such a huge hit. Is because of the amount of detail and how vibrant and luminous the skin looked. Oil painting was brand new, and Da Vinci was seen as exploiting all the possibilities of oil paint. You can change the viscosity of the paint by adding additional solvent, or such as turpentine, or in our case, we're using Gamsol. Varnish may also be added to increase the glossiness. In your kit, you do have a Damar varnish. We'll talk about how to use that later on. Also, the thickness of the coat can have a considerable bearing on the amount of time required. Oil paint does take a long time to dry. That's one of the downsides to it. But we do have some mediums that you can add to the paint that will help speed up the dry time. That's what your Galclid is in your kit. Acrylic paint is a type of medium in which the pigment is suspended in a plastic or synthetic resin. So the unique thing about acrylic paint is that it can mimic oil paint. So instead of using the natural oils like linseed in oil paint, it actually has these synthetic mediums. It does have the advantage of drying faster than oil paint and also being water soluble, so you don't have to use any of those solvents to clean your brushes with. The downside to acrylic paint is also that it dries fast. You have less time to work with it. So we're going to add additional mediums that help slow down the dry time. That's a retarder in your kit. And we're also going to add additional meanings to change the viscosity of the paint. So that's what your matte medium is in the kit. So we're going to try to do some things that are actually going to make it even more like the possibilities of oil paint. And just as an aside, as we go through these, each time we have a demonstration, I'm gonna talk a little bit about both oil and acrylic paint. You're gonna follow along with whatever medium that you're using for the class. The next thing I wanted to talk about was brushes. In your kit, if you bought it from the bookstore, you should have a variety of brushes. The brushes in the kit are synthetic brushes. And there's also different types of, the paintbrushes themselves are described depending on what the end of the brush looks like. So you see here a few examples. On the left is round, very good for details. We have flat, bright, filbert, fan, angle, mop, ringer. So I'm just going to go quickly kind of what each one is good for here. For the most part, as I mentioned in the first week, kind of going over the materials and syllabus, you know, The main ones you really need to get are the rounds and the flats. The additional ones are also nice, especially when you kind of get into finessing the paint more. But a lot of the tricks that you could say use a bright or filbert for, oftentimes you could use a flat. So we'll just kind of go over what each brush is typically used for. So a round has a round or pointed tip. It's good for sketching, outlining, detailed work. It's great for if you're kind of edging or lining areas. You can kind of think about it as a narrow round paintbrush. It has a pointed tip. The pointed round is good for fine details and lines. Oftentimes these brushes are very little. Flat has a square end with medium to long hairs. It's good for bold strokes, washes, filling. These are also good when you want to kind of blend some parts together. They're ideal also for varnishing. A bright is a flat edges that curve inward with shortish hairs. These are good for short controlled strokes, heavy color. If you want a kind of a big, bold, bright stroke, that's something that a bright is good for. A filbert brush is a flat and oval shape with medium to long hairs. It's good for soft blending. So if you're trying to blend two colors together, notice how there's not like a really hard edge to the sides of it. That's why it makes a really good blending brush. And it can also cover more space than around. So if you had something that you wanted kind of soft edges for, you could fill up a large area with it. An angular flat is flat with sort of an angle at the end. It's good for curved strokes, filling corners, like if you have sort of a hard to reach spot. It can also be used to cover a lot of space, similar to flat brushes. A fan is good for smoothing, blending, feathering. Oftentimes if you want to have like textural effects like clouds or leaves, there's something you can sort of fill in areas that have a texture with. A detail round has round hairs that are shorter. Oftentimes you'll see people use these for models, those kind of things. They tend to have a short handle to them. They're good for details and short strokes. They hold more color than you would think. So just to go over the anatomy of a paintbrush, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about how to clean your brushes. It's very important when you're cleaning your brushes that you only fill your brush cleaning jar to before the wood is crimped. So if you see, there's sort of the different parts of a brush. You have the bristles on the end. The ferrule is the part that reaches around and clamps the bristles in. It also attaches the brush to the handle. Now what happens when you get wood wet? It expands, right? What do you think happens to that metal ferrule and crimp when the wood expands? Well, it's going to expand too, right? And what's going to happen is it's actually going to loosen its grip on the bristles. So if you want to maintain your brushes, you want to avoid the wood getting wet. So that means you're going to try to keep that handle out of your Gamsol or water when you're cleaning the brushes. So you want to kind of keep your water or Gamsol level just below where it's going to hit that crimp line. Another thing that was mentioned before in the opening one is that brushes come in different sizes. As you can see, as the size increases, the number of brush also increases. It's good to have a variety, but you know, if you have, say, a 10 flat, you don't necessarily need a 12 flat. It might be better to have a 10 and then a 14 or 16, right? Because there's sort of incremental increases in between. As you go down in size, you'll see you get to 0, and then it's labeled 2 over 0, 3 over 0, 4 over 0. You can kind of think of those as decimal points. Sometimes the brushes are labeled, once you get to 0, then it'll go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 0, 0, 0. Sometimes it'll be labeled like that as well. And those, for example, the 4/0, that's your very fine little detail brushes. I would say I would try to get your hands on at least a 0 because it's nice to have a nice little fine detail brush. Unless you're super anal, you probably won't need a 4/0 brush, but it depends on what level of kind of little tiny detail you like to get into. Okay, so brush maintenance. This is really, this is really important in that you want to keep your brushes clean so they don't get super damaged. Brushes can cost a lot. If you take care of your brushes, they can last a long time. It also, if you didn't spend as much on your brushes, sometimes they're damaged more easily, so this is also important to keep your brush maintenance. Um, the key is a lot of times people think that you're going to rinse your brushes clean. You don't want to do that with oils or acrylic paint because with acrylic you can rinse them in the sink, but you're trying to keep most of the acrylic paint out of the sink because what can happen is that it can dry in your trap and then you'll end up having to have a plumber come to clean it out. So before you start to clean your brush, you actually want to wipe away any excess paint with a cloth or soft tissue, paper towel. My suggestion to all of you is to cut up some old sheets or old t-shirts, something cotton that you can use as your rags. They clean better, they're more absorbent than paper towels, and you won't go through a million of them because you can let them dry and reuse them. Um, I would also, so you would use that to clean your cloth off first. You want to gently squeeze the bristles from the ferrule edge outwards toward your fingers. You're trying to remove all of the paint with the cloth. Now this is for oil. Next, you're going to rinse the brush in your Gamsol. If you've got one of the brush cleaners, you can kind of dig it down in there and wedge it in between the uh, grating that I gave you to get it all out. And then you're going to wipe it on a cloth again to remove the excess paint. If you're using acrylic, you're doing the same thing but with water. You're going to kind of dig it into your brush cleaner, use some lukewarm water, loosen up all that paint, and then wipe the cloth again to remove any excess paint that you loosened. Once you have the brush wiped clean, you're then going to use a tiny bit of mild soap. Dish soap is the best. They sell those brush cleaner soaps at Michael's and stuff, but you are actually going to use a dishwashing gel like Dove or something like that will clean your brushes better. Gently work the soap into the brush and then go ahead and rinse it off and repeat until there's no trace of any color coming out. Like I said, you want to have all the oil paint definitely off before you start this because it can kind of gum it up. And then rinse one more time in lukewarm water to remove any traces of soap. Use your fingers to gently shape the brush back into its correct shape. If necessary, if you have to lay it flat, you can also wrap tissue around it to kind of help it dry into the correct shape. And then leave your brushes to dry at room temperature. It's best if you're at home, if you have like an old jar or something that you can leave them dry standing straight up than laying down. It's much better. If you're worried about the toxicity of the paint that you're working with, you can wear gloves. I will say if you've bought the colors in the kit, those are all mostly non-toxic colors. The Gamsol is the safest solvent you can use. There's some information provided within this module about the Gamsol and how to use it safely. Um, the other thing that I would say, there are certain paints that can be considered toxic that you don't want to get on your hands. Most of those are the cadmiums. Um, most of the very toxic paints are actually pretty expensive, so you would know if you spent a lot of money on your paints. You would probably notice the price difference if you were to get one of those more toxic paints. You should make sure whenever you're looking at your paints when you buy them, they do have labels. It'll give you a warning if something like that was in the paints. And if you're worried at all, like I said, the best thing is just to wear gloves. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is palette knives. In your kit, you should have a palette knife. This is what we're going to mix the paint with. We use palette knives instead of brushes to mix our paint because you're going to get a cleaner mix. Brushes, when you're mixing, can hide bits of other paint in it, and then you have to keep repeatedly cleaning them. And you actually lose a lot of paint within the brush. So you're wasting paint by mixing it with a brush. When you mix with a palette knife, they're very easy to clean off. They're made of metal or plastic, and you can wipe them clean in between and ensure that you're getting the nicest, cleanest, purest colors. This is a variety of different shapes. Typically, my favorite one to use is one shaped like number 3. The one that in your kit is shaped like number 6 or 9. Those are also very popular ones to mix with. It kind of just comes up to a personal choice. Palette knives can also be used as a tool for painting. Our second to last project this semester, we will deal with palette knife painting. So we will use those as an actual painting tool later on in the semester. So hopefully at this point, most of you have gotten your paints. If you look, there's all kinds of labels on the outside of a paint. One of those labels refers to the permanence of the paint. The permanence is the length of time that a pigment will retain its original color. It's one of the reasons that you want to use paints that are made for artists. They tend to not change color as much as they dry. They tend to be more light fast and not fade when exposed to the daylight. So that's something that is important. Another thing is the opacity rating. This got a little bit messed up in the slide, sorry. Each one of the different paints uses different symbols to represent the opacity of colors. So if something is opaque, it'll be that black dark square. If something's semi-opaque, it has a black and white square mixed together, meaning that it's a little bit see-through. If something's semi-transparent, it's going to have that line through the white, so meaning it's pretty see-through. And if it's transparent, it'll be totally see-through. A lot of times what happens is that people are using paints that are transparent or semi-transparent, and they're wondering why they can't coat over what's underneath. So if you're having an issue if your paint's not fully covering, look at the paint to see the opacity level, because if something is opaque, it's not going to light through. It's going to cover over what's underneath more easily. If something is transparent, which actually you do want transparent paints a lot of the time, we're going to practice painting with transparent paints. You're going to see what's underneath it. So that's the reason why there's two different types of paints. Transparent paints tend to be cheaper, while opaque paints tend to be more expensive because there's more pigment within it. And there's different styles of painting too. Impasto is a thick application of paint that stands raised up from the surface. It's designed to create texture and depth. Alla prima is a style of painting where instead of building the colors up with layer, the painting is done all in one session. It's also called wet on wet. So there's times that we want to paint detailed and see-through. Other times we're going to try to paint thick and paste-like. We'll actually work on both types of those paintings this semester. Scumbling is another term where we're sort of using the paint in a dry sort of manner to create almost a stippled pointillism effect. And it's ways that you can let the paint see through underneath. So you have the full strength of the paint, the scumbled, the way the paint looks when it's scumbled or sort of drag thin. And the other way is a glaze. And a glaze is a thin, transparent layer of paint. Glazes on top of one another build up depth and modify colors in paint. We're going to use a lot of different glazing techniques in this class because it's some of the ways that you'll actually learn how to build a painting and create more detail. It's through those transparent glazes that you can create a lot of detail and interest. An underpainting is the initial layer of paint applied to a ground which serves as a base for the subsequent layers of paint. Now, we are going to do a lot of different types of underpainting this semester. So each painting that we start this semester, we're actually going to use a different style of underpainting. The base that you start with, or the underpainting, actually affects the way the painting looks, and it affects the techniques that you're going to use over time. So that's one of the main things that we're going to learn about this semester. Grisaille is a term for underpainting executed entirely in monochrome or near monochrome. So typically shades of gray, sometimes shades of brown or black. And oftentimes it's sort of used as a building block through which overtop colors are created, because you're basically taking care of what's called the values first. And value refers to the light and dark qualities of a surface area, sometimes referred to as the tonal values. So if you focus on the light and dark of the piece, you're then able to add color over top. One of your first projects that you're going to work on, which we'll also go over here very shortly, is a color wheel. So a color wheel is one way to think about how you mix your paints. And on the color, we don't talk about the color wheel in terms of color. Often we think of them as hues, and hue is pure color on the color wheel. It's something that hasn't been altered or changed yet. The color wheel consists of primary colors, so red, yellow, and blue. Secondary colors, red and yellow, secondary colors are orange, green, and purple. And then the tertiary colors, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, green, and violet. We're going to go over in the next PowerPoint how to use all these colors within a color wheel. We also talk about monochromatic. Within each wheel of the color wheel, you're actually going to alter the way it looks. So you're going to do things like change the tint or the hue with white added, or the shade, the color with black added. So you're actually going through all the values of one hue on one little pie slice of that color wheel. Last thing I want to talk about is the palette. So each one of you is going to have your own palette. As I mentioned before, you should have a glass palette. It's very important for the oil people to use glass, because any kind of other surface the oil can kind of bend through. For those of you in acrylic, as I mentioned in the opening PowerPoint, you can use a glass palette. It's very easy to clean. You could also use one of those wet palettes if you're trying to kind of make your paints last faster. You could also use wax paper. The oil people should use glass because you want to save your paints when you're done. You can make your oil paints last a very long time. And with the glass palette, all you got to do is wrap it with some saran wrap when you're done, and you can save it for your next painting session. So the glass makes it very easy to do that. You can use an old window frame. You can use, they sell glass palettes actually at Dick Blick's or Michael's. The cheapest thing is just to find an old picture frame, put a white piece of paper. It's very important that it's white, and you have your palette set up for you. Now, when we're setting up a palette, you want to make sure that you have your colors spaced all along the outside. This is, there's two types of palette. This is a basic palette and an advanced palette. But if you notice, they've stuck colors next to each other like they would as if they were in the rainbows or from a color wheel, right? So they sort of go in the order that they are in the color wheel. That way there's less color contamination, because, for example, if I put an orange next to a blue, the cross contamination would turn it brown, versus if I have an orange next to a red, you're just going to get a little bit warmer orange. So it still makes the paint choosable. So that's why it's important you kind of put your paints out along the edges in that order. The second reason is you want your middle space to be your mixing area, so that I can actually mix my different colors as I move inwards. So the goal is to kind of limit the contamination. You're mixing inward. The middle is your color space that you mix those paints within. Another important term that we're going to talk about a lot this semester is fat over lean. Now, fat over lean is the principle that allows you to create your paints to be archival. So the idea behind this is that each layer of your painting should have a little bit more oil paint medium added to it than the one that's underneath it. And has any of you ever shaken up a dressing that has oil and vinegar within it and how the oil and vinegar separate? The same thing can happen if you put too much oil over top of a layer, or if you put a layer that doesn't have enough oil over top of a layer that has a lot of oil, it actually separate or bubble apart. It creates this cracking look to it so that it separates itself. So if you have a very oily layer, and I put a layer that has less oil, it gets all crackly or bubbly over top of it. And that's actually what happened to the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa, if you look at detailed images of it, has a very defined cracking. So um, a lot of Da Vinci's pieces, because they were just figuring out the properties of oil paint, actually have this issues with cracking or paint falling off. So what we're trying to do is follow the fat over lean process. It's something I'll talk you through as we start painting, so that your image is archival. Archival refers to the ability of items to withstand the effects of time. Now, one thing that we're going to do, this is actually one of your assignments for this week, is that we're going to prepare the surface of our painting to be archival. And that starts with what's called using a layer of gesso. Gesso is a mixture of glue in either chalk or plaster of Paris that's applied to a ground, so you're coating the surface to give it the correct properties to receive the paint. Gesso actually pH balances the surface of the paper, so it will make your paper sturdier. Paper can actually be very fragile to UV light, so it'll actually degrade or fall apart over time. If any of you has ever let newspaper or colored paper sit out, you'll notice how it'll start to change color and degrade. Gesso will actually stop that from happening to the paper. The other thing that it's going to do, it prepares a surface that's very porous that allows the paint to grip to the surface. So the paint is actually less likely to fall off, get that cracking, do those other kind of things that can be issues. So that's the two reasons we're going to kind of start off by gessoing our paper. And I'll go over those steps. You'll see it's within this further down the module. Last vocabulary term I want to talk about this is composition. We'll talk about this a lot. The composition is the combining or parts of the elements of a work of art. We're thinking about the whole piece of paper. That's something that you're going to think about in your first project. You want to think about creating a composition where you've used up the whole page. All parts are equally as important. And how those pieces work together are something that we're going to talk about the rest of this semester.